All right, welcome everybody to season 4, episode 5 of the ShadowDragon Podcast. And today we have a very special guest, Melisa. An honor to have you on board. We also have David, of course, our director of marketing, and myself, the director of intelligence and collection innovation at ShadowDragon. Dave, can you quickly say hi to the folks before we introduce Melisa a little bit more in depth?
Hello, everyone. Welcome again, and thank you for listening.
All right, cool. And then we have Melisa Stivaletti. Sorry, for me, it's such a hard name to pronounce when with my Dutch accent. You're a director, the OSINT director at Guidehouse, and you're the chair of immersion professionals, the intelligence community. I love the acronym EPIC when it comes to that, and the committee at AFCEA, which also comes down that you won a very prestigious award, the Technet Cyber Award for under 40. So very cool to have you on. Can I just bombard you with my first question because I love OSINT. I've been practicing OSINT for almost 3 decades now. So my question would be, how did you find OSINT, or did OSINT find you?
I think the answer for all of us is that OSINT found us in some kind of a way. But when I was in Afghanistan as a Department of Army civilian in 2010, 2011, there was the Arab Spring, right? And I think that showed a lot of professionals in the intelligence and defense communities how critically important looking at different domains in open source, particularly around social media, is, right? And it was so clear that if without an understanding of what's emerging in the open source domain, we were going to miss a huge amount of intelligence. So that's kind of what got me started, in my passion there. But it really grew from there. And so I have been all in on OSINT ever since, from the academic perspective, from sort of the intelligence diplomacy side of the house and unclassified information sharing to the nitty gritty of OSINT targeting. I just found that it is quickly becoming the primary source of intelligence, and we have to get on board. So I love OSINT, and I'm glad it found me.
Yeah, yeah, and I love that reference to the Arab Spring because also remember that very vividly. It was so awesome to see that finally you had eyes and ears everywhere, no matter where you were, and you would get a very quick understanding on what's going on in emerging threats. So I love that you gave that reference. I don't hear that too often when it comes to the OSINT realm. That people tend to forget. Quite a while ago now, right? And just knowing how the internet evolved of that. So you're now in that national security space, and almost everybody in the DoD Army and Director of National Intelligence have come out with that strategy specifically for OSINT, which made me very excited as a Dutch national because I've been striving for this for years within the Dutch government as well as in the European government. So I was very happy to see that those steps were taken. So when it comes to that, what does it signal to you that importance that is seen and acknowledged in the U.S. and in the U.S. government? What's your reflection on that?
Yeah, well, there's two parts of these strategies, and I'd like to highlight the piece that all of the strategies you just mentioned were published publicly. They were unclassified and they were published publicly, which tells us and signals to a number of different folks that we are getting serious and that we need industry's help. Because by publishing it, we're putting it out to industry and saying, look, this is where we're going. We need to go there with you. Here's what we can share. Come along with us. So that's one really important signal. The other one is so that we're all moving together in the same direction. Because OSINT doesn't have its own agency in the same way that SIGINT has NSA or GEOINT has NGA, for the federated network of operators in the open source domain, from the strategic to the operational to the tactical level, to all be moving together with a similar vision, even as a federated workforce, is really important. And so having these strategies come out, knowing that they were all coordinated with each other, which, as you know, we were talking earlier about the pains of bureaucracy, it's a big deal. And so that, I think, gives us a lot of hope for the future of open source intelligence.
Yeah. So, but listening to what you just said, if you would boil it down to the essence, where you just said we need, let's say, private as well as government working together, why
Mhm.
do you think, if you would need to tell the audience, why is this so important? Because I think a lot of folks that are not in government don't really understand why government needs, let's say, larger commercial companies to help them. Could you
Yeah,
could you fill us in a little bit more on that?
absolutely. So I think it's true that public-private partnerships are the special sauce of the United States government large, but I'll drill it down a little bit to the open source domain in particular. Almost every tool that we use, every capability that we use in OSINT is dual use. So there's a commercial use case for what we need in the US government for intelligence purposes. So those dual use technologies, because they are funded by commercial, reasons, or they're, whatever it is, gives us the sort of the edge on venture capital resources, all this. So it's less of a burden on the increasingly resource constrained environment in the US government, and allows us to get a little more innovative. It also gives us the ability to lean in and use tradecraft and techniques and data that were meant for other things. And then the other piece there is that leaning in on industry gives us access to a really diverse workforce, a workforce that is not necessarily tied to one geographic location where the US government is. It can also accommodate people who, their lifestyle doesn't really enable them to be a government servant, or maybe they don't want to deal with a clearance or whatever it is, but they do want to be part of the story. And having that commercial side of it and leaning in on industry really empowers them
Yeah,
to
yeah,
leverage, the whole of expertise and technology.
yeah. Thanks for highlighting that because I think that's something that a lot of people that I come across don't really see yet. That is so important, that overlap between public private. Um, Also, what I thought was really good that you pointed out that there is no official, let's say, OSINT agency. But again, when I look at my career for almost 30 years, and when I listen to your background and your career, almost, or I think, and I strongly believe in that every intelligence investigation, no matter where it is, if it is in US, if it is in Europe, somewhere, always has that open source intelligence component. And if not, then you're doing your investigation short, especially nowadays. There is always a part in your investigation where you can leverage publicly available information to enrich maybe your internal data or other data. So yeah, I just love that you highlight that. I don't hear that too often, so that's very great to hear. Dave, I think you had a question that you wanted to ask, Melissa.
I do, but I just to piggyback on some of this, the thing, and full disclosure, Melissa and I used to work together. But the thing I think when I got into OSINT and doing work within ODNI and some of those places, that the fact is there is a market for open source intelligence in the public sector. And like you said, Nico, there's this dual use. And
Yeah.
so, before we go back to the professionalization, Melissa, what do you see the future, the blending of the private and public sector, and then, you know, working with partners as well, foreign partners, because open source intelligence is not classified. It's not, you need a lot less intelligence sharing agreements. So do you speak to that real quick?
Yeah, so the fact that tradecraft is so similar in both the commercial space and in the government space for some collection methods for very different reasons, right? And it empowers us to work a little bit more closely together for similar means. And we see this in cyber as well. It's not unique to just OSINT, but OSINT is a great example. We've seen that the OSINT community has also been able to lean into what you were mentioning, the sort of intelligence diplomacy and intel sharing, especially around Ukraine. we've seen that, and it will come in very handy around other areas that may be, in Asia here in the next little bit, right? So the fact that we can share validated and 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 solid information with our allies without revealing sensitive sources and methods is really it's powerful. And I believe that we don't lean into it enough, honestly. And if we're not careful, we'll get our bureaucracy around that and overclassify it and then lose that special sauce. So it's something that I have a very close eye on, and I'm really excited about the future for what open source intelligence can do for our allies and for our relationships across commercial and internationally as well. But it's something to be protected because of bureaucracy could eat that up too.
Yeah. So, well, speaking of bureaucracy, but the thing I think that is sort of beautiful about this is that we're crowdsourcing a lot of the open source intelligence, and so you don't need to be a government employee or an operations officer or something like that to use it. In fact, all you need is a phone and a Twitter or Facebook account, and you can be your own journalist. But okay, bureaucracy. Yeah. Hey, it works. When seconds matter, you'll take it. But okay, the House.
I can't help myself, David. I got to go back to that. You know, it is true that in many cases, if you give a teenager unlimited cloud storage and $1 million, they can probably do as much as any government organization is doing in open source around a specific topic right now. That is true. However, I do want to just highlight in terms of the professionalization of OSINT. Just because you have an internet connection doesn't mean you're an OSINTer, and just because you have a good idea and you're really good at sleuthing and moving around the internet also doesn't mean you're an OSINTer. OSINT is an elevated int that, in my opinion, should be just as respected as HUMINT, SIGINT, and GEOINT. It is hard, and the skills that you need are hard skills. We need people who can moonlight as data scientists, as private investigators, as really intense cyber experts, being able to find provenance, like having advanced OSINT skills is critical for the professionalization of the int. And there may not be movies right now about the, James Bond, but there will. And I promise you that is where we're going. And we have to be able to encourage the next generation of folks that are interested in intelligence to go into OSINT because it's the future, and it's not just having an internet connection. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. You went there. I had to go there.
Yeah. No, you're 100% right. And sometimes I default to, for those who have been in government and in the military, there are two sides to this, and there's the operations side and there's the intelligence side. And OSINT as an intelligence discipline is absolutely becoming, well, it's always been professional, but it's becoming more professionalized, more formalized from actually the work that you've done, Melissa, and a whole bunch of folks on your team. Where I default is the operations side, where you've got 6 minutes to get to the target or something, and you're scrambling to look at on Facebook or Twitter to see if somebody took a picture in advance to look. So, which is not actually OSINT. That's
I think the difference is the difference between, and that's what a common mistake that's very common within the OSINT world is the difference between OSINF, open source information, and open source intelligence, where people just find information, they drop it somewhere online, and now the world knows, but it lacks the context, it lacks the entire process of analysis, exploitation, and that kind of steps. And that's also something that I have to admit that Melissa pointed out really well. I worked for a fair bit amount of time at Bellingcat, where you have a large army of, let's say, armchair investigators, which again do awesome work, but very often jump to conclusions or maybe misinform informed or may be influenced by others. So the bias, the fallacies. So there's a little bit more to it. But I do get it. Sometimes time is of the essence, and you just want to grab what's out there real quick. But again, the discipline itself, it's something different. But yeah, good that we highlighted it as a little crew here.
Yeah. All right. Are we good? Are we good?
We're good. We're
Yeah,
good. We're
yeah.
good.
We're no longer angry, Dave.
Okay.
I couldn't be angry with you.
Yeah. Yeah. It's we can, yeah. Okay. Okay. The House Select Permanent House Select Committee on Intelligence just stood up a subcommittee on open source intelligence. The very first the very first subcommittee that's ever had its own dedicated committee for the intelligence discipline. So going back to some of the strategies and professionalization and the formalization of open source intelligence, this to me signals that Congress, not only the DoD and the intelligence community, is willing to throw resources behind it, but Congress is. And so that also, I think, is an outlet for an open discussion in formalizing this process. So I don't know if you could speak to that a little bit and how excited you are, but I'll give it over to you.
Yeah, I can't tell you how excited I am that there is a dedicated committee. I wish they were also appropriate, but the no, genuinely, this dedicated committee on OSINT tells us that the legislative branch is serious about the open source intelligence discipline. And this is critically important because OSINT has been grossly underfunded for a very long time. And we've been able to do more and more with less and less for a real long time. But there's going to be a breaking point. Hear me now. You may be like, oh, well, we can't cut this whole satellite over here because you can't just lop off a piece of the satellite, right? But we can just cut this one data set over here. So what happens is you can just cut and cut and cut around the edges of OSINT until there's almost nothing left. And David reminded me that Jason Barrett, the OSINT executive, has pointed out that the national intelligence budget for the NIP is we have less than 1% goes towards OSINT, at least insofar as we're able to track it. That doesn't include publicly available information that's purchased in support of other ends. So I do want to be fair around that, but it's low. Dedicated OSINT funding is less than 1% of the total national intelligence budget, and it makes up over 30% of the PDB generally on average. The PDB is the president's daily brief, which is in strategic intelligence, that's the goal, is that if you're an analyst, is that your information, or a collector, is that your information has made it into the PDB. And the fact that those percentages are what they are is astounding. So think about what we could do if we had more than 1% of the budget, right? The problem is our budget is almost never safe. It's almost always cannibalized by other higher priorities, and it's not really protected. And there's a lot of people who come out and they go on these amazing podcasts with brilliant people, and they talk about the importance of OSINT, but then often don't put their money where their mouth is. And the fact that we have a subcommittee in the HIPC gives us that real true dedicated voice for open source on the Hill, and I am so excited about it. And I've met several of the staffers. I'll be meeting some of the members. It is refreshing, I'll just say, how eager they are to learn about the INT and the needs and just getting smart on what it is. Like that's half the battle is understanding, oh, if you cut off this data set or this tool, there's real consequences. And if we lose our budget, like this is what this actually is going to look like, right? So that's really, really encouraging. They're also, of course, interested in the structure of the INT and, how can we have a more optimized structure. I will say, there's not a lot of things that you can throw money at a problem and it actually gets better. I think OSINT is one of those things where, maybe before we do anything massive, we just try properly funding what we have for just like a minute, see what happens, and then move from there because of course, there's a more optimal way to structure OSINT than what it is right now. It's not optimal, but it's also not had a chance to be optimal because the budget has not ever been what it should be.
Should be like a commercial for the price, for the low price of one F-35, you can have an entire OSINT agency. But
I mean, yeah, it's not wrong.
yeah,
It's definitely not wrong. But also, what I think what really resonated with me, the comments that you just made, is that when you look at that 1% that's now being spent, but also knowing how, in my world, when I look at all the other intelligence disciplines, OSINT is by far the one that expands the fastest when it comes to tools and capabilities. Um, so, but also is the one that needs that budget due to that ever evolving change that happens every day. So to
Right.
be able to stay on top of that food chain, to be able to have eyes and ears everywhere, and to be able to collect intelligence, you need a budget, right? Because you need
Right.
never-ending research and development, which means you need to explore tools, you need to refine tools, you need to adjust tools, you need to adjust disciplines, policies, everything. And that comes with time and money, right?
Right.
So when you look at that, and you've been in OSINT for quite some while now, what are these evolutions that you have seen that are really striking to you?
Yeah. So it's been wild to watch, even just the last 2 years, what generative AI has been able to do for open source. Because one of the main problems that we've had over the last decade is that the sea of information has just exploded in the open source domain. And even if you had a billion people doing an open source intelligence collection, you still aren't going to be able to get everything. And then if you do get everything, you can't make sense of it, certainly. It's too much information for anyone, for any country. And so having the ability to leverage generative AI to help us with sense making, especially summarization and reporting and so much more critical. It's been so exciting to see that evolution. And of course there's risks, right? We talk about hallucinations and mis and disinformation and the fact that generative AI isn't going to be a subject matter expert, right? Like we and so some of the folks that I work with that are OSINT collectors are like, oh my gosh, is AI going to take my job? And I'm like, no, but a collector who knows how to use AI. And the fact of the matter is we can use it as a tool to really speed up our collection and sense making process and to help us not miss, right? So what I am excited, we don't really have it quite yet, but I'm really looking forward to what's going to happen in the next couple of years around indications and warnings. So the INW side of the house and generative AI. It's not quite there yet. So if you're industry, if you're ShadowDragon, just saying that's an area that I'm really interested in seeing what happens on early indications and warnings. But yeah, generative AI definitely the coolest.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I fully agree. And also, just what you pointed out, the analyst is now more important than ever because now they have that access to vast volumes of data way more efficiently, which also makes the role of the analyst so much more important towards AI because they are now. And I recently wrote a blog about AI and the risks of AI making analysts lazy because some of these models are so convincing that they just formulate their words like this is now the truth, but you as an analyst will still need to validate the outcomes of AIs or large language models in general. So what is your opinion on when it comes to AI and using, let's say, commercial AI versus in-house AI with, let's say, maybe stronger guardrails?
Yeah. So one thing, and maybe this is a challenge to any of our industry partners that are listening today, is that sourcing is really important. So when I get a generative AI summary, want a footnote next to every single sentence telling me what source it's coming from so that I can go back and look at that source. So if you're just giving me the big overview and telling me to trust it, like I'm not going to use it. I have to have that. I absolutely have to have the sources. And source characterization is something that we do that's critically important. I want to know, is this state media, is this biased in whatever way? Having that source characterization is really important as well. And in terms of the government, confined space versus like, the chat GPT that's leveraging all of the internet, I'm always going to prefer that more confined space so that I have a little bit more control over my sources. I might have a starting point with the big swaths of information, but as a strong collector analyst, you can't use that, at least not yet, without digging in a bit more.
Yeah, and also just the pollution of large language models where they're now training on their own data on the internet
That's right.
or but on the other end, it's also a great tool to leverage where people are now uploading their entire internal documents to a system. And if you ask the right question, you might be able to
Yeah.
get the information out of there. So yeah, again, the time will
Prompt
tell, right? In the
engineering.
coming years. Yeah, yeah, prompt engineering. And I think that's also something that I think I teach a lot of OSINT classes and this is why I really want to emphasize on students like, hey, you as an OSINT analyst, you know how to Google Dork, for example. Well,
Yeah,
the next level is prompt engineering. You need to
prompt
be able to
engineering.
ask the right question. And that's always when it comes to intelligence collection, asking the right question is the key to success. But prompt engineering is a profession on its own, I think, and there will be OSINT prompt engineering specialists in the near future. Dave,
Not unlike the other intelligence disciplines as well. If you're a human, if you're a
Yeah,
SIGINT, you got to know where to look and what questions to ask. So
yeah, absolutely.
yeah, you got to ask the right questions. Prompt engineering. Yes.
Yeah, for sure. So looking at this question, so intelligence operations and in the US they are separated. So intelligence and operations they are separated due to oversight. Well, it's the same, I think, in most countries, the same in my country as well. So how do you, in this case, see open source intelligence or publicly available information feeding into operations in today's world when it comes to that?
Yeah. Operational and technical open source intelligence is very different than the strategic level. Our partners at SOCOM, JSOC, and all the special operators out there, a bunch of you are headed to Soft Week. Your tradecraft is it's critically important and incredibly differentiated from the strategic level of open source. And I know that we're a little tight on time, and I honestly think that this topic probably needs a full episode. So I'll just leave it there because there's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, cool. Well, then, since we're a little bit on time constraints, I'm really eager to ask this last question because for me, that's very important. What is in your book the biggest misconception towards open source intelligence in the IC community or in the IC space?
Yeah, it's cheap, but it's not free. So back to the budget. It's not just Googling, it's getting more and more expensive. Cloud storage is outrageous. Like so the funding line, and also that it's somehow inferior to the other ends. The people that I work with are some of the most brilliant people I've ever met, the public servants across the US government, some of whom you will never ever know. Really some of the most brilliant people I've ever met, and it is a hard discipline. So if you want a challenge, become an O center.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. 30 years in, still learning every day. So, and there's never a dull moment. If you like learning, this is the best place to be in.
Yeah, and
yeah,
it's getting harder. Also,
Yeah.
right.
it evolves. So you think you've mastered it, and then you have to. So if you're a lifelong learner, like OSINT is where you want to be.
Yeah.
Every day is back to the drawing board. Every day. Well, Melissa, I want to thank you so much for your time, and I think we should definitely have you back on because I we can probably fill a bunch of episodes with you. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Dave, do you have something to close off?
No, I'll send you an invite right after this.
All right, cool. Well, Melissa, it's been an honor. Last words are for you.
My privilege. Thank you so much, guys.
All right. Thank you so much, and thanks everybody for listening. And do not forget, I really want to say this once: like and subscribe. I feel so flashy right now.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you so much. It's
Hey,
awesome.
thanks, guys. What a privilege. Have a great day.
Same to you. Cheers.